The morning began with the familiar creak of the stairs as my parents loudly discussed and packed things into the car. I watched them haul suitcases and debate the route, all under the hum of the car engine warming up in the cool morning air. Our country house, surrounded by dense woods, seemed to have a life of its own, slow and unhurried. On days like these, when my parents left, I usually felt a sense of lightness and freedom. But not today. "Don't miss us too much," Mom winked as she got into the car. "And try not to kill each other," Dad added with a good-natured chuckle, glancing at Jake and me. We stood on the porch, keeping a respectable distance from each other. I nodded while Jake just smirked, leaning against the doorframe. We were left alone, surrounded by silence, broken only by the fading sound of the car driving away. I tried to ignore the faint chill running down my spine, maybe from the light breeze or perhaps something else entirely. Returning inside, I buried myself in working on a college project. A notebook filled with calculations, a laptop displaying diagrams. It was the usual, orderly routine I thrived on. In moments like these, I felt truly in my element. But Jake's sudden voice shattered the calm. "Starting this early? Isn't Saturday meant for relaxing?" he said, appearing in the living room doorway with a mug of coffee in hand. His shirt was slightly crumpled, his hair tousled, but there was a confidence in his casual demeanor that always managed to irritate me. "I have a deadline," I replied curtly, without looking up. Jake came closer and sank onto the couch across from me. I could feel his gaze lingering on me, unsettling and intrusive. It's funny," he began with a faint smirk. "We've lived under the same roof for years, but I hardly know anything about you." His tone was soft, almost teasing, but there was a subtle seriousness beneath his words. "What exactly do you want to know?" I finally looked up. His eyes lingered on mine a beat longer than I would have liked. "Well, for starters, why are you always so composed? Is it something you were taught, or were you just born like that?" He leaned back as if throwing down a challenge. I felt a strange tension building between us, odd and misplaced. This wasn't just banter. It was as if he was searching for something he couldn't quite articulate. "It's called self-discipline. You should try it. Might come in handy," I replied with sarcasm, though my voice betrayed a hint of unease. Jake simply smiled. "Maybe I will," he said, standing up. His footsteps echoed through the room, leaving me alone with the lingering feeling that he had started something but left it unfinished. By morning, my progress on the project had been minimal. Every line seemed unruly, as if the text itself refused to be controlled. My thoughts kept circling back to the morning conversation with Jake. His words, his gaze. It all left a strange aftertaste. All day, I tried to convince myself that nothing out of the ordinary had happened. Probably just my imagination. That evening, I settled in the living room again, surrounded by books and my laptop. The usual silence of the house, which typically helped me focus, had the opposite effect this time. It was interrupted by the creaking of floorboards and the occasional sound of Jake's footsteps in the kitchen. I could feel his presence even when he was in another room. Eventually, he appeared, carrying 2 cups of tea. His steps were slow, almost cautious, as if he didn't want to startle me. Jake sat down beside me, placing one of the cups in front of me. "You look like 2 armies are fighting inside you," he said, nodding toward my laptop. "Caffeine or lack of sleep?" "Both," I muttered, not taking my eyes off the screen. The tea looked tempting, but I tried to ignore his attempt to draw me into conversation. Jake leaned back against the couch, studying me. His gaze was both direct and distant, as if he were contemplating something important. "Tell me, I'm curious. Do you always live by a schedule? Is every day a checklist?" He finally broke the silence. "Yes. It helps me avoid chaos," I replied, typing to avoid looking at him. "Interesting," he mused. "What do you do when something doesn't go according to plan?" His question caught me off guard. I froze, feeling as though any words I might say would lose their meaning under his steady gaze. "I handle it. I always handle it." I replied curtly. But I didn't believe myself. Maybe you should try chaos. Sometimes there's more freedom in it than in order, he said softly, almost as if he were speaking to himself as much as to me. It's easy for you to say. You live however you want. I couldn't resist throwing a jab at him. Jake merely smirked. Maybe it's not as easy for me as you think. Silence hung between us. I tried to focus on the screen, but my thoughts were a tangled mess. Why did this conversation feel so significant? It was as if there was something unspoken, something he either couldn't or wouldn't say. Suddenly, Jake stood up. Let me know if you want to take a break, he said, heading toward the door. But at the doorway, he paused, glancing back for a moment. By the way, the tea will get cold. That'd be a shame. His words sounded like a hint, as if there was an entire mystery hidden behind the cup of tea. I watched him leave, feeling a strange heaviness settle in my chest. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual, before the sun had fully risen above the trees. Not wanting to stay inside the house, I decided to take a walk along the path that led into the forest. The morning chill wrapped around my shoulders, the leaves beneath my feet rustled softly, and the air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. Nature always calmed me, bringing me back to myself. But my solitude didn't last long. I heard footsteps behind me. Turning around, I saw Jake. His silhouette stood out against the sunlight filtering through the trees. He walked casually, unhurriedly, but his presence disrupted my inner peace once again. Do you always walk in the forest alone? He asked as he caught up with me. I thought you were still asleep, I replied, unconsciously quickening my pace. I woke up and noticed you were gone. Thought I'd check where you'd gone off to, he said. His tone was neutral, but his gaze was unusually focused. We walked in silence for a while before he spoke again. Do you come out here often? Sometimes. It's peaceful, I said, trying to keep my tone distant. Yet, I was surprised to find that his presence didn't irritate me the way it usually did. Peace is good, he observed, but sometimes it hides things we don't want to see. Are you philosophizing, or is this another attempt to throw me off balance? I glanced at him over my shoulder, adding a touch of irony to my words. Both, he smirked. You know, I always thought I had you figured out. You never show what's going on inside you. But lately I'm starting to think I was wrong. His words stopped me in my tracks. I turned to face him, trying to decipher what he meant. Jake looked at me with a seriousness I hadn't seen in him before. Why are you saying this? I asked, feeling a strange nervousness building inside me. Because I find you interesting, he replied simply. And I think you're a lot more complex than you want people to believe. His words caught me off guard. I lowered my gaze, avoiding the intensity of his stare that seemed to pierce right through me. I'm just trying to be myself, I said after a long pause. Maybe. But sometimes I think you're afraid to show yourself, Jake said with a shrug, as if he didn't want to pressure me but couldn't hold back from speaking his mind. We continued walking, but the conversation had shifted the dynamic between us. The forest now felt different, less of a refuge and more of a space where every word carried weight. Jake began talking about his childhood, reminiscing about building forts with his father and the time he and his friends got caught in a downpour at the lake. I listened, and at some point I realized he wasn't just sharing stories for the sake of it. He was revealing another side of himself, one I might never have noticed before. By the time we returned to the house, I was unsure what to think. Jake had disrupted my usual sense of order again, and I was starting to realize that I might actually like the chaos. Evening descended softly over our house, carrying the faint scent of rain that threatened to fall but never quite began. I decided to cook dinner to distract myself from everything that had unfolded over the past few days. I chopped vegetables, focusing on the precision of the knife rather than the silence, which had grown uncomfortably thick. Of course, I wasn't left alone for long. Jake entered the kitchen as if he had always been there. His light steps didn't disturb the calm, but his presence made the air feel heavier. He moved silently to the sink, filled a glass of water, and leaned against the edge of the table, watching me. Need any help? He finally broke the silence. No, I've got it, I replied shortly, not even glancing in his direction. But inside I felt a tightness. Why was he standing so close? You don't have to do everything by yourself, you know, he added, leaning over the table to get a better look at the vegetables I was carefully chopping. Are you aiming for perfect carrot cubes, or should I just wing it? His light teasing broke my rhythm. I couldn't help but smile faintly. All right, just don't ruin it, I said, handing him the knife. Our hands brushed, and though it was just a fleeting touch, it felt oddly significant, as if the moment stretched and held a deeper weight. Our eyes met, and I suddenly felt a flush creeping up my cheeks. You're so strict, yet your hand's cold, he murmured. His voice was calm, but there was something in his tone that made me look away. Let's see how useful you are in the kitchen, I said, trying to change the subject and sound upbeat. But my fingers still remembered the sensation of his touch, making it hard to focus. Jake got to work, but his movements were unnaturally precise, as if he were trying too hard. We stood side by side, and in the small space, it felt like every breath and movement fell into sync. When he handed me the chopped pieces, our hands brushed again, and this time the pause between us was palpable. Jake smirked, as if he wanted to say something but held back. Not bad, I muttered, attempting to sound indifferent. But inside, everything churned. It's all you. Your perfectionism is contagious, he replied, his voice quiet but carrying an unexpected warmth. I felt his gaze linger on me, and my heart thudded in response. Just then, a flash of lightning illuminated the window. I turned toward it, and his reflection in the glass appeared too close to mine. It lasted only a second, but it felt like time had stopped. Looks like the rain started after all, I said to break the tension, stepping aside. Jake gave a brief nod, but his eyes seemed to say something else entirely. I couldn't decipher it. The tension between us had become almost tangible, like the electric charge before a storm. I continued cooking, but the sensations from that small encounter stayed with me for the rest of the evening. After dinner, I finally stepped out onto the veranda. The evening was quiet, and the rain that had started earlier had softened into a gentle drizzle. The lights of the string garland draped along the railing cast a warm glow, creating an almost intimate atmosphere. I settled on the wooden bench, wrapping my hands around a mug of hot tea for warmth. Overhead, stars sparkled, and in the stillness of the night, I tried to gather my thoughts. But solitude didn't last long. Jake's footsteps thudded softly against the wooden floorboards of the veranda. He stepped out without a word, holding a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. His presence was like a sudden spark in the darkness, bright and charged. Mind some company? He asked, stopping by the railing. I nodded, though a strange mix of tension and anticipation swirled inside me. He sat down beside me, pouring wine into the glasses. His silence felt unusual. Jake was normally quick to fill the quiet with jokes or casual remarks, but now he simply stared off into the distance, as though lost in thought. Tough day? I asked, breaking the silence. It sounded like a polite question, but I genuinely wanted to understand what was on his mind. Not really, he replied softly, finally turning his gaze to me. More like strange. You know, sometimes you think you have everything under control, and then something changes and you can't ignore it. I gave him a tight smile. You're speaking in riddles. Maybe, he said with a faint smile, though his eyes held a seriousness that unsettled me. We sat quietly for a few minutes, with only the sounds of the night and the faint crackle of the string lights breaking the stillness. Then, suddenly he spoke again. You probably think I've always been this carefree, but the truth is, I've never really felt certain that anyone cared about the real me. His voice was quiet, but his words were disarmingly honest. Why are you telling me this? I asked, feeling a subtle shift in the air between us. Because you're the only one I don't want to pretend around, he said, turning to face me. His gaze was so open, so raw that it left me breathless. I didn't know how to respond. His words threw me off balance, leaving me feeling exposed. I lowered my eyes, the warmth of the tea in my hands suddenly seeming irrelevant. "Jake," I began, but he interrupted me. "Wait, let me finish," he said, his voice softer now, but the weight of his words made it even harder to hold back the flood of emotions. "I don't know how else to say this. It's been building for a while. You're not just my sister, not just someone I share a house with. You've become something more. And I can't keep that to myself anymore." I stared at him, speechless. His confession hit me like a bolt out of the blue. Fear churned inside me, tangled with something unfamiliar, something I couldn't yet name. "I don't want you to feel awkward," he added, looking away. But I needed to say it. "Just tell me if this is stupid, if I've ruined everything." I stayed quiet as my mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. Finally, I forced myself to speak. "You're right. It's strange. And terrifying. But I can't deny that something between us has changed." The relief in his expression was palpable, and I felt the tension that had hovered over us all day begin to ease. "I don't want to destroy what we have," I said softly. "But maybe it's too late to ignore this." We sat in silence again, staring at the stars as if they might offer us some kind of answer. That night, it felt as though the entire universe was watching, and the weight of that realization was both frightening and exhilarating. The next day passed as if in a haze. I tried to focus on my art project, shutting myself in my bedroom. But thoughts of the previous evening, of Jake's words, wouldn't let me go. Every memory of his gaze, his voice, that confession, it all replayed in my mind over and over, as if my brain was determined to dissect the moment down to its smallest details. At some point, I heard a soft knock at the door. It was him. "Am I interrupting?" Jake asked, cracking the door open just enough for his face to peek through. "Not really," I replied, putting down my sketch. "Is something wrong?" "Not at all. Just wanted to see what you're up to," he said, stepping into the room with the same ease he always carried, as if the space belonged to him. He stopped at the table, and when he saw my drawing, his eyebrows rose in surprise. "You did this?" he asked, leaning closer to the sketch. His hair was slightly tousled, and his shirt was casually tucked in, a look that somehow made him seem comforting. "Trying to. It's just a rough draft." I shrugged, trying to sound composed, but his proximity brought back that strange, unsettling feeling. "Mind if I—" he asked, picking up a brush without waiting for an answer. Jake added a few strokes to the horizon line, his movements fluid and deliberate. "There. Feels better now." I sat frozen, watching his fingers move with confidence, as though he knew exactly what he was doing. "You can draw?" I asked, barely hiding my surprise. "Not really. Dabbled a bit back in school," he said, turning his head so close to mine that I could feel his breath. "But you're clearly much better at it." For a moment, silence settled between us. His face was just inches from mine. Too close. His gaze, soft yet filled with some unspoken anticipation, locked on me. "You know," he began quietly, as if afraid to shatter the fragile calm surrounding us, "you've never really let me into your world, but I want to be a part of it." My thoughts raced. I didn't know how to respond. And then, in that moment, his hand, still holding the brush, brushed lightly against mine. He leaned closer and kissed me. Before I could fully process what had just happened, he pulled back, glanced at the sketch once more, and smirked. "All right, I'll leave you to finish your masterpiece." I stayed frozen as he walked out. When the door closed behind him, I finally allowed myself to exhale deeply. After Jake left the room, I sat in silence, staring at the sketch. The lines that had felt so deliberate only moments ago now seemed meaningless. It was as if he had left behind a lingering tension in the air that pressed down on me even in his absence. Determined to avoid any chance of running into him, I grabbed my sneakers and headed out for a run. The cold air forced me to take deep breaths, an attempt to steady my thoughts. But every step, every sound of the forest reminded me of his words, his touch. I felt trapped in my own emotions. When I returned, Jake was sitting on the porch with a book in his hands. He looked up when he saw me but said nothing, offering only a brief nod as if he understood I wasn't ready to talk. I walked past him into the house, doing my best to maintain composure. Deep down, I hoped he would stay outside. But minutes later, as I rummaged through the fridge, Jake walked into the kitchen. Once again, that tension filled the space, the sense that he was too close, even if he wasn't touching me. "Good run?" he asked, opening the fridge next to me. "Yes," I replied curtly, avoiding his gaze. My heart was pounding too hard for me to speak calmly. "Look," he began, his tone quieter now. "If I made you feel uncomfortable—" "It's fine, Jake," I interrupted quickly. "Let's just go back to how things were, okay?" I tried to sound firm, but my voice betrayed a slight tremble. He looked at me with an unreadable expression, then sighed softly. "Go back to how things were?" he repeated, as if testing the weight of the words. "All right, we'll try." And with that, he left, leaving me standing in the kitchen, surrounded by a silence that felt unbearably loud. In the days that followed, I did everything I could to avoid him. I buried myself in my project in the bedroom, took long walks, or locked myself in the living room with a book. Each time I left a room, he was somewhere nearby, but we kept our interactions brief, never lasting more than a few seconds. Yet, the avoidance only seemed to make things worse. I started noticing strange habits of my own. How often I found myself listening for his footsteps behind the walls. How I waited for a chance to catch a glimpse of him through a window. Or how his voice, even muffled, caught my attention. It was maddening. One evening, certain that Jake had gone out for a walk, I sat on the porch with a book, hoping to enjoy some peace. But within minutes, he stepped out of the house holding a mug of coffee. Our eyes met, and in that moment, I realized our attempts to avoid each other were only complicating everything further. He didn't say a word, just sat at the far end of the porch. I turned back to my book, but the words blurred on the page. I was acutely aware of his presence, of his occasional glances in my direction. We sat in silence, but the unspoken tension between us seemed to vibrate in the air. That night, I finally admitted to myself that running away was pointless. The more I tried to maintain distance, the stronger the pull toward him became. The morning began with an unexpected proposal. As I stretched my shoulders after hours of work on my art project, Jake knocked lightly on the doorframe of my room. He looked calm, but there was a spark in his eyes that often preceded something out of the ordinary. "Let's go to the lake," he said abruptly. "Why?" I asked, not looking up from my sketch. "Because here we're circling each other like caged animals," he said plainly, without a trace of challenge in his tone. "Out there, it's simpler. Fresh air, the water. We can just let it go for a bit." I wanted to refuse, but something in his gaze told me it was pointless to argue. Besides, a part of me wanted to break out of this endless loop. I shrugged. "Fine, but not for long." We grabbed our bikes and headed toward the lake. The path cut through the forest, and as the trees rushed past, I felt the tension between us begin to dissolve. Jake kept his focus on the road, and oddly enough, it made me feel more at ease. By the time we reached the lake, the sun was high in the sky, its reflection shimmering on the still, glass-like surface of the water. We left our bikes near an old dock. It was so quiet, it felt as if this place existed outside of time. "Have you ever been here before?" I asked, breaking the silence. "No, but it's nice," he replied with a smile. "Seems like the perfect place to relieve some tension." His words carried a hint of something deeper, but he quickly looked away. We sat on the grass near the water. The gentle breeze played with my hair, and for a brief moment I truly felt free. But nature had other plans. Dark clouds began to gather over the forest, and within minutes, a light drizzle turned into a downpour. Over there, Jake shouted, pointing to a small abandoned cabin at the edge of the woods. We ran, laughing at the suddenness of it all, and barely made it inside before the rain grew heavier. The cabin was empty, but surprisingly cozy despite its weathered wooden walls and the faint smell of dampness. We stood by the window, watching the rain, laughing at how drenched we'd become. This wasn't exactly the relaxing trip I had in mind, Jake said, wringing out his shirt. Well, you wanted chaos, and you got it, I teased, feeling the familiar distance between us starting to melt away. Silence filled the space between us, heavy yet unspoken. Jake, standing just a little closer than necessary, suddenly looked at me with a seriousness that made the air feel electric. His voice dropped to a near whisper. I thought I could ignore it, but I can't. Can't ignore what? I asked, my heart pounding. What I feel, he admitted, his gaze steady. Every time I'm near you, I can't pretend. This is more than just a bond. It's something deeper. The air in the room grew heavier, as though this moment had been looming for a long time, unavoidable, yet terrifying. I didn't know what to say, how to respond, because my own emotions were such a tangled mess that the words stuck in my throat. I get it if you don't feel anything, he continued. If this means nothing to you. But I can't keep it to myself anymore. I stared at him, trying to make sense of it all. His words, his gaze, his very presence. It all overwhelmed me. But deep down, I knew the truth. What I felt was too powerful to deny. This is complicated, I finally said. Too complicated. But I can't say I don't feel anything. He stepped closer, his eyes a mixture of relief and trepidation. We'll figure it out. I just don't want this to stay hidden anymore. The rain continued to drum against the roof, as if urging us forward. I didn't know what would come next, but in that moment, it felt like our lives were already intertwined, no matter the consequences. That evening, when the rain finally stopped, we returned home. The silence between us was no longer intimidating. It felt calm, as if we were both lost in our own thoughts. Jake suggested building a fire in the backyard, and I agreed, hoping the flickering flames might help me piece together the storm of emotions inside me. The fire caught quickly, its glow reflecting on Jake's face, making his expression appear even more serious. I sat across from him, wrapped in a blanket, feeling the warmth of the fire slowly thawing my cold hands. Jake was quiet, but his gaze stayed on me, unrelenting. I remember sitting around a fire with friends when I was a kid, he began, his eyes fixed on the flames. One of them said fire burns away everything you throw into it. He called it magic. Childhood stories, I said, trying to sound dismissive, though his voice and the calm it carried seemed to draw me into a new space where our usual barriers didn't exist. Maybe, he agreed, but sometimes I want to believe that fire can burn away fear. Yours, mine, everything that holds us back. His words hung in the air, waiting for me to respond. I felt his quiet anticipation, but every part of me resisted. Finally, I sighed. Jake, I don't know what to say. All of this feels wrong. Do you realize this could destroy everything? Our family, our connection. I don't even know who I am when I'm around you anymore. My voice trembled, and I looked at him, hoping he would understand. He met my gaze, his eyes filled with both pain and determination. I know it's complicated. I know we're walking a thin line. But can you honestly tell me you want me to bury this? To pretend nothing happened? My heart clenched. I knew he was right. I knew our feelings wouldn't disappear, no matter how deeply we buried them. But the fear was overwhelming. I'm scared, I finally admitted, clutching the blanket tighter. I'm scared we won't be able to control this, that it'll only end in pain. There will be pain, he said quietly. There always is when something real is at stake. But I'm not afraid of it if it means I can be honest with you. If it means we can at least try. His words felt like a revelation. They were simple, yet they tore through everything I had carefully built to keep these feelings at bay. I looked at him, searching his eyes for answers, but all I found was the truth I'd been running from. "I don't know how to do this," I said softly, "but I know I don't want to pretend either." He nodded, and a flicker of relief crossed his face. That's all I needed to hear. We sat by the fire, watching the dancing flames in silence. The world felt different, more fragile, but also brimming with a new kind of strength. We knew the road ahead would be filled with difficult decisions and unknowns. But that night, under the stars and the crackling fire, we took our first step toward honesty, not just with each other, but with ourselves. The next morning, the house felt different. Not physically. The walls, windows, and furniture were all the same. But the atmosphere had shifted, as if the silence that once separated us now held a shared understanding. We were still cautious, but every movement, every glance carried more weight than before. I noticed it for the first time during breakfast. Jake silently poured himself coffee while I busied myself with the toaster, but the strained distance that used to linger between us was gone. When our hands accidentally brushed on the table, neither of us pulled away like we might have before. Instead, he smiled. His usual playful smile, but now softer, warmer. After breakfast, I suggested we clean the house. It was my way of regaining some control, of grounding myself in routine. Jake agreed, but instead of working separately, he stayed close. We moved boxes in the storage room together, sorted old books, and dusted shelves side by side. Every time I looked up, I caught him already watching me. "Do you always tackle everything this meticulously?" he asked, flipping through a stack of magazines. "I try to. It makes things look cleaner and simpler," I replied. "But not easier," he observed without looking up from his task. I didn't respond. His words stirred something inside me, but I didn't know how to confront it. The day passed in its own quiet rhythm, but between us a subtle game had begun. When I walked past him, his hand would lightly graze my shoulder. When I bent down to pick something up, his gaze lingered just a moment too long. And the strangest part? I found myself looking for him, too. A brief pause in conversation, the sound of his footsteps behind me. Each little moment seemed to carry a new significance I couldn't fully grasp. By evening, we found ourselves in the kitchen, cooking dinner together. This time, everything felt simpler. No tension, no masks. We worked side by side, chatting about mundane things, but every glance and every smile hinted that we'd crossed a line we couldn't uncross. At one point, Jake handed me a knife, and his fingers brushed against mine. I looked up, and our eyes met. In the silence, I felt a new kind of tension building between us. Almost tangible, but not frightening. It felt like a promise of something more. "Thanks," I said, trying to sound neutral, though my voice wavered slightly. "Anytime," he replied with a small smile, turning back to what he was doing. After dinner, we sat on the veranda, watching as the forest slowly disappeared into the night. This time, he sat closer than usual, and I didn't resist. At some point, Jake broke the silence. "I know we agreed to take things one step at a time, but sometimes it feels like one step isn't enough." I turned to him, his words washing over me in a wave of warmth and fear. "I feel the same," I admitted, almost in a whisper. He didn't say anything more, just nodded, but it was enough. We both understood that we couldn't rush this, yet every moment we spent together carried new meaning. We didn't know where this path would lead, but for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to take the risk. The night was warm and quiet. The stars hung above the forest, as if watching over us, filling the silence with their serene light. We sat on the veranda, lost in our thoughts. Jake appeared relaxed, but there was a tension in his gaze, as if he was bracing himself for a conversation he'd been postponing for too long. "I've been thinking about this all day," he said at last, breaking the silence. His voice was steady but cautious. "We can't keep living like nothing happened." My heart tightened. This was the moment I had both anticipated and dreaded. Jake looked at me, his eyes unwavering. We either take the risk or we run, he continued. But I don't want to run, even though I know this won't be easy. I need to know what you're feeling. I tried to find the right words, but they caught in my throat. Images flashed through my mind. Our parents, the years we had spent under the same roof, the fine line between what was acceptable and what wasn't. But then I thought of his gaze by the fire, the touch of his hand in the kitchen, the strange ease with which we could be ourselves despite everything. That memory tipped the scales. I'm scared, Jake, I admitted finally, my voice trembling. But I'm not scared of what I feel. I'm scared of what it might destroy. Our family, our bond, everything. He nodded as if he understood exactly what I meant. I'm scared too, he said quietly. But you know what scares me more? That we'll never know what could have been. That we'll spend our lives carrying this inside, pretending it didn't happen. His words struck a deep chord. I looked at him again and realized the truth. There was no going back. We had crossed a point of no return, and that realization was both terrifying and liberating. If we try, I began slowly, carefully choosing my words. It has to be with caution. We can't risk everything without thinking it through. One step at a time, he said softly, his voice steady with a confidence that almost made me believe it could work. We sat there for a long time, not speaking, savoring the silence that no longer felt heavy. When he finally broke it, his words were simple. Yet they carried everything I needed to hear. I'm willing to wait as long as it takes. I nodded, a faint smile forming on my lips. This was a risk we both knew we were ready to take, understanding fully that the road ahead would be challenging. For the first time in a long while, the future didn't feel as daunting as it once had. We stayed there, watching the stars that continued to shine brightly above the forest. They were witnesses to our decision, and I knew this night had changed everything. Ahead of us lay a journey full of uncertainty, but within that chaos, I felt more alive than ever before.